Hello to everyone. Welcome to the 50th SNF Dialogues live webcast, and actually the first dialogue discussion of the year. As most of you know, Dialogues, an initiative of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, is a monthly series of discussions to encourage the open, free, public dialogue, but also to promote the exchange of ideas and all this across geographical, social, and cultural lines. The dialogues are held through IMED, a non-profit journalistic organization founded with the exclusive donation of Stavros Niarchos Foundation. And every month we discuss issues that concern us all. Let's jump straight into the topic we will be discussing today. During the pandemic, we've seen a steep rise in violent crimes worldwide. Domestic violence has increased, fueled by lockdown orders. Homicide rates across the US cities jumped 30% from 2019 to 2020, while gender-based crimes and other violent acts have been recorded globally as well. So one may wonder, has the pandemic pushed humanity into more violent behavior? Has it made us more tolerant, let's say, to the violence? Or has this virus uncovered a pre-existing problematic social issue? Social science suggests that periods of disruption and change, such as the one we live in, are volatile. However, in the long run, what is the overall social impact? And can we shield ourselves as a society? This is what we're going to discuss today, and we have the pleasure to do that, to have with us Erin Kleinberg, Professor of Social Sciences at New York University, and Alex Piquero, Chair at the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Arts and Sciences, Distinguished Scholar at the University of Miami. Thank you both very much for accepting our invitation to join this very, very, I would say, the most sensitive discussion we ever had all these years we have been running SNF Dialogues Initiative. Welcome. Later on, we will watch a pre-recorded interview with Kiki Petroulaki, who is a psychologist and president of the European Anti-Violence Network. Those of you who live in Greece and watch us now, you for sure have seen a tremendous increase in gender-based violent crimes. Dr. Petroulaki will share not only insights on domestic violence and femicides, but will also discuss how our society and institutions are putting up obstacles to women who try to escape an abusive relationship or marriage. I want to highlight, before moving forward to our discussion, that everyone watching us can be part of this discussion right now, and please do it. This is an open, live dialogue, as you already know, so please share your questions, thoughts, and concerns via snfdialogues.org/questions, email snfdialogues@snf.org, or through our social media accounts on Facebook and Instagram at SNF Dialogues. And actually, I would like to start this conversation with two questions that we received by you, by our viewers, when we announced the topic, and I believe that will help us frame the discussion. I would like both of you, Eric and Alex, to reply to these questions. Are our societies more or less violent compared to the past? And if I may add, just a clarification from my side, which indicators should we examine to determine if we are more violent than in the past? And is violence really increased in our times, or do we get more information about it?
So I'll go first for a second, and then Eric can chime in, of course, and add his two thoughts. So first of all, thank you very much for having me on this very important topic. It's an honor to be with everybody around the world. I wish as well we could be in Athens, but times are what they are. So I think you have three questions there, which really are like about 15 questions. And I think we have to put things into perspective. And the last 18 months of our lives, whether in Miami, in New York City, in Greece, wherever we are, has been nothing that we've ever been accustomed to. There's no playbook of a book on my shelf that says, okay, this is what you're going to do during a worldwide pandemic. And so you got to, go backwards in time and rewind the tape and say what was going on to our lives in February and March of 2020, and nobody knew what was going on. And so that led to anxiety, it led to stress, it led to anger, it led to people being locked up at home, it led to increase in alcohol sales, it led to increase in guns, it led to increases in opioid disorders, as well as emergency room visits. And then we started to see spikes in crime. But you can't divorce the pandemic from what also happened in the United States with the killing of George Floyd. We had two pandemics, really, a social unrest pandemic and a public health pandemic that started to fuel an increase in violence in the United States, basically on community gun violence, that necessarily wasn't seen around the world. So the last 16 months about violence in the world is really a uniquely American problem.
I think that's So also it's lovely to be here. Whatever here means these days, I'm still struggling to figure that out. But nice to be on the screen with you both. I would add to what Alex just said, that there's also a kind of crisis of democracy, a rise in polarization and distrust in many places, not all, and that if you go back to February or the beginning of 2020, you're also looking at a world that's in the grips of a climate emergency that adds a level of stress that's existential and that pits, generations and different people in the world against one another. And so this is all to say that this moment is not just a pandemic moment. It's a moment when there are overlapping crises that are smashing into one another. And I think you said this very well in the very beginning. As social scientists, we know that when there are periods of instability and dramatic social change, it feels as if everything is in the air and our behavior is volatile. And it's hard to think of a time more than the last couple of years when our behavior has been so volatile and when so much has been up in the air. And so no doubt there are expressions of violence that we can measure and see real spikes. So for instance, homicide in America has become significantly more serious issue than it was 2 years ago. That said, homicide in America is a bit of an outlier because we have so many guns here. And also, homicide in America had been significantly down in the period right before the pandemic. And we remain far less homicidal than we were 10, 20 years ago, 30, certainly 30, 40 years ago. And so it's important to keep these trends in perspective as much as we want to be attentive to the urgent problems of the day.
I kept many notes because you jumped into the topic and to the core actually of the topic. You mentioned, Alex, twins pandemics, a pandemic within a pandemic. Eric, you said about the crisis, the crisis that democracy has to face, something that we also see happens in Europe. And of course, both of you mentioned the polarization, the existing polarization, and actually the distrust to the institutions. And one question, but I would like to bring it in a few minutes to our discussion, has to do with trust to the science and to the science. And exactly because all this period we had to follow very specific orders. But I feel, and maybe I'm wrong, that we lost something in the middle of the way. And I feel that this is our trust. Let me skip my questions because I wanted to ask you what types of violence have you seen in increase during the pandemic? You already described them. And I would like to ask you, Alex, you started researching the impact of the lockdown in Dallas area, and then looked into other cities' data. What did you find? Because it would help us to have into our minds some cases and some examples in order to get deeper to this issue?
Thank you for the question, Anna. When we were in Dallas, my wife, another professor of criminology, and I were literally sitting around when we immediately went into lockdown. And one of our first hypotheses was, what are relationship couples or families with children going to react to this new world that we have to live in? And so one of our hypotheses as criminologists was, it wouldn't surprise us if we saw an increase in domestic violence, at least in the short term, and a decrease in child report cases as well in the short term, because teachers and school systems are more likely to see evidence of child abuse cases. So what we did in Dallas is we looked at the first month of the lockdown and looked to see if domestic violence incidents increased in the period prior to the lockdown and then the immediate 1 month thereafter. And we found exactly that, an evidence of a spike in domestic violence in Dallas. And that was corroborated by an increase in the calls to domestic violence hotlines. Now, that was one study in one city for one month of time. And so the natural question that social scientists ask are, can we replicate this in other places in the US and around the world? So as part of a member of the Council on Criminal Justice, and I did a meta-analysis of all the studies that had been published, as well as government reports around the world that looked at domestic violence, regardless if you looked at it through arrests, through hospitalizations, through calls for service in the United States and abroad. And we found an overall increase in domestic violence, regardless of how you study this, in the United States, in Canada, and throughout the European Union. And so that is, it's an unfortunate, but not a surprise in the sense of what kinds of stressors are implicated in domestic violence. You had stress, anxiety, anger, people stuck together for a period of time without any kind of outlet. You couldn't go to the gym, you couldn't go to the movies, you couldn't do the things that we take for granted. And we saw that increase in domestic violence. And one of the things that worries me as a scholar is, what are the long-term effects of the pandemic going to have, especially on women who did not return to the workforce at the numbers that they were in the beginning, as well as what's going to happen to the kids. We know one of the strongest risk factors for later violence is exposure to violence. So if they're seeing violence in the home, and remember, we're usually only measuring physical violence. If we are detecting increases in physical violence, there's undoubtedly going to be an increase in emotional violence. So that's what we detected right at the onset of the pandemic.
And since you mentioned the emotional violence, our next topic of discussion in February would be mental health issues. Eric, according and following actually to what Alex just mentioned, do you believe that should a discussion have been initiated to be more socially prepared, not only for the health crisis, but also for the collateral damage of the pandemic that affects society? And we have received a similar question that we can see on the screen that asks about the consequences of, for example, teleworking or teleeducation, as Alex just mentioned, and if these constraints are leading to outbursts of violence.
It's hard to say, I think, in retrospect, whether we didn't do all of the right kinds of preparation before this event. I mean, manifestly, the answer is no, we were not prepared. No, we could not consider all of those things. But I think the truth is that we were overwhelmed by the severity of the situation and the extent of the closures that the situation warranted in places around the world. I think we're also unprepared for the kinds of disagreements, the level of divisiveness that would emerge around it. You could very easily have imagined a world where, when faced with a global health threat that's easily communicated, we established new bonds of solidarity and decided to look after one another in unprecedented ways. Right? The fantasy of the science fiction movie where the human race, always divided, finally bonds together because aliens come, and we all have a unified threat. And we have had that unified threat in climate change, and we clearly had that unified threat acutely with the pandemic. And I think, unfortunately, our differences and disagreements were exploited and we turned against each other in myriad ways. I want to emphasize Alex's point about the long-term consequences here, because I think there's some reason to be optimistic that the acute phase of this pandemic will not last forever. I mean, pandemics end. I don't know if it will be the Omicron that ends it or if it will be, several variations down the road, but we won't be in this stage forever. We have, however, gone through this kind of extraordinary social experiment and been subjected to extreme conditions that will have an impact on us. The issue of what happens to young people, to teenagers, adolescents who have been stuck at home, who've been deprived access to supportive institutions, of people in their 20s who will have really struggled to launch careers, who feel a kind of a level of despair about the state of the world because of, again, democracy, the pandemic, climate. I think we come out of this event with a number of significant challenges. And I think the mistake we would make now is saying our future has already been determined based on what's happened. We're in the midst of this social experiment. And one reason why it's so urgent for have these conversations is because despite all of the things we've done wrong in the last 2 years, what we do in the next 2 months and 2 years will make all the difference.
Can you please both share with us some thoughts or examples, if you have, in terms of what social scientists in general, have already started to understand and recognize in terms of the effects of the pandemic and the situation of the pandemic on human behavior?
Well, can I say first that let's go to the issue of trust, because it's come up immediately. And I think it is intuitive for us at this point to believe that, we have different opinions about the vaccine. We have different opinions about which medication matters. In the United States, we're so polarized that there's a liberal and a conservative medication that people prefer. And so it's easy to think of this moment, especially given the dominance of the United States in global public discourse, as one where distrust is everywhere. But we have a lot of data already that show that in most societies, trust has increased, that trust in science has gone up, that trust in government has gone up, because many places on earth have actually done a fairly reasonable job of dealing with the pandemic, of expressing uncertainty. It is a miracle, for instance, that we have this vaccine that's as powerful as it is. It is in some ways a miracle that there is not as much poverty as you might have expected. Which is not to say that we don't have poverty and homelessness and suffering, but I would have predicted far more poverty and despair, for instance, in the United States than we've had, because government policies have done a lot. So I think it is important to recognize that while one story from the pandemic is about distrust and polarization, and that is certainly a thing that we will get in the media. We have a media system that tends to exaggerate our differences and play up our ideological divisions. Some global empires that are dedicated to that very cause. That's not the full story, and there is a reason. There will be a reason to walk out of this pandemic with a kind of belief in the capacity of government to do things like alleviate poverty that not everyone shared beforehand.
Yeah, let me add. Those are really good answers, and I'm glad Eric brought up the positivity here. Hundreds of thousands of people have perished, and that could have been many, many more had the vaccines not been developed the way they've been developed and rolled out, and they still need to be rolled out in other places to scale up and scale out, so we can put this the worst behind us. But I think there might be some good that has come out of the pandemic. And so I'm always looking as a scientist, okay, so there's a lot of bleakness, but there's got to be something here that we can draw from. And because we always are focusing on the adverse consequences of things, but there are good stories of people who've had a reevaluation of their lives, whether they've gone on to different careers or or moved in different directions. I think that there are those kinds of stories that we don't hear about very often, but there is this sense of, collectivism, that all of us experienced this one thing. So we can be of different races and ethnicities and from different parts of the world, but there's one experience that has affected all of us. Now, the question is, how do we interpret that experience? How do we learn from that experience? And what do we do moving forward? I think that there's going to be some good there over the long term as well, as Eric pointed out.
Well, in a way, I think that there are many people who see this as a kind of dress rehearsal for, our capacity to manage a problem like the climate emergency, right? Like life
exactly.
in the Anthropocene.
Exactly, and how we, as both of you said, how we could recognize this opportunity that, among others, this pandemic and the conditions of this pandemic offer to us in order to reevaluate, rethink, and reapproach finally many, many major issues, exactly because this virus uncovered a pre-existing problems in terms of the lack of trust, of the polarization, of the climate crisis, and all these problems are not new, and they don't started being, due to the pandemic, but we saw them, but we saw them in parallel, and all of them. This is, if I may, what I feel and what I believe in terms of the pandemic, and I repeat it, in terms of the conditions of the pandemic.
Well, so for instance, let's think about another thing that's clearly been accelerated by the pandemic, a social change that was happening before that's affected our lives now, and that is, the rise of remote everything, including social life, social media, mediated interaction. People around the world were flocking to their screens to do things like spend time with friends, date, like shop, and even work before the pandemic. And the pandemic has really accelerated it. And I've seen, for instance, with social media, which is a topic of endless fascination, I think, for most of us, because it represents such a change in the way we engage each other. On the one hand, a sense that social media is a tool of division, right? Facebook, for instance, has these Facebook groups so that I can opt into a news group that will just tell me things I want to know. So I can create an alternate reality for myself. I can live inside of one algorithm where I'm only going to be fed, information that supports my view about whether a vaccine is effective or whether my political candidate is, supporting America or against America, and I can inhabit that world. And so it's impossible to believe that these technologies are not divisive. At the same time, I think one of the extraordinary trends that's come out of the pandemic is the rise of these mutual aid networks around the world, where people who realized that the government was not going to take care of everything and that they needed to help out their neighbors, found creative ways to work collaboratively to problem solve. This again is something that has been happening before, but every time I hear a conversation about the end of society and the end of civility and the rise of violence, I think, well, yes, but also there is an incredible increase in local level grassroots mutual aid. And if you spend time, as I have over the last couple of years, observing how mutual aid networks work, they do it through Facebook groups, they do it through social media. And so the exact same technology that tears us apart is also a tool for bringing people together. And we are infants when it comes to managing life with this technology. In a way, the pandemic tells us it's time to grow up and find some better policies.
And since you just mentioned the issue of trust, we just saw, and if we could please say it again, the question we received from the audience in terms of the role of the media. So the question says, I believe that the great responsibility for the increase of the emotional disorder of the people is the broadcast of every negative and bad event by the media, and especially by television. Could the foundation and the scientific community intervene through the government and change the sad landscape of television a bit? It is totally outrageous what we are watching and listening on daily basis. First of all, let me clarify that the Stavros Niarchos Foundation cannot be involved in principle with a government policy on the media or any other government policy. We're doing something totally different. However, allow me to inform you that the foundation, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, has active international programs that support independence in journalism, through, for example, the non-profit journalistic organization IMED, which stands for Incubator for Media Education and Development, but also supports the freedom of speech and public debate advocacy through the monthly series of SNF Dialogues Initiative, under which we hold this discussion right now. However, in the occasion of this comment, I would like to ask you, what is the role and the responsibility of the media in the increase of violence? And what is the role and the responsibility of media in the environment of polarization you mentioned that has been cultivated?
I have a couple of quick thoughts on this. I think, and I'm a firm believer that we live in a marketplace of ideas. And we subscribe to those ideas that we want, and we turn the page or flick the screen to the next set of ideas. I think that, as Eric mentioned very cognizantly, people are self-selecting what kinds of groups they want to be part of, what kinds of accounts or people I want to follow. So there is this sense of a selection effect that you will continue to have your points of views emboldened or strengthened or supported, because if you just keep looking at those feeds and reading those things, they're going to give you exactly what you want. And the problem is, and the good about technology and social media is it gives us information at our fingertips that 20 years ago we just didn't have in record time. The downside is that we don't expose people to the ranges of ideas. And I have this really good example of when I used to go to the gym, because I haven't gone to the gym in a couple of years. So now I work out at home. One of the things of the pandemic. The gym I used to go to had 7 television screens. It had CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, ESPN, the Weather Channel, and then the local news. And it's fascinating to watch at the top of the hour, what the headline is across all of those different screens. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that media, their job is to transmit, in my world, objective information. When they have opining, then it gets a little bit cloudy. But we have to be training our youth and educating the kids in school, and it starts very early. It doesn't start when they get to college, when Eric and I see them, but it starts much younger, when they are exposed to a range of ideas, some of which is good, that they're going to challenge their worldview at that time. That's how we learn. That's how we grow up. So it's a little bit of both. I'm not trying to be on the fence here, but there's good and bad. But I strongly believe that we have to be very careful about any words of regulation, because we do live in a marketplace of ideas, some of which we're going to like and some of which we're not going to like.
I mean, I hear you about that, and I think that the challenge is that we don't really have a news media ecosystem that's sustainable or set up to give people the information they need to self-govern. And the American news market is more of a marketplace of ideas than others. We have very little public support for public media. And, instead we have a system that's really dominated by kind of interest in capturing eyeballs, profit-making media. And one thing that we know is that the way you capture eyeballs is with extremism. And I think one reason why we believe that for instance, I can tell already that many people who are part of this conversation believe that we live in a more violent time than ever before, that society is falling apart. And this is a staple of news media coverage. It's a very sexy and desirable idea that the world is falling apart and we're more violent than ever. It's much more interesting than the fact, which is actually, we've been on a fairly steady downward trend in terms of violence for the last several decades, with the exception of the last couple of years, in which we've been living in an acute pandemic and emergency. And I do think that we are in a trap here because the marketplace has taken over with some very corrosive effects. And my view on this is that the role of public media has never been more important, and the role of nonprofits and philanthropy in coming up with independent sources of information that are not driven by the profit motive is important. And the challenge is that there's kind of so much ideology to deal with here. So it matters because, for instance, if we think about the Murdoch empire, which is global, there's an ideological objective to promote distrust in government, because it wants to promote kind of an opposition to regulation. It's the fantasy is a world that's run by business. And in my view, that this is a kind of an act of violence towards democracy and towards social justice. And we don't really have a countervailing force in the absence of kind of public pro-democracy media or a nonprofit pro-democracy media. And so I'm bringing up democracy, and I hope you don't mind, because it seems to me like the conversation about violence has to include not just interpersonal attacks, but also the attacks on our democratic systems, which are the foundation of modern life. And this seems to me like the kind of thing that we can't be Pollyannish about. There is a sustained and expensive campaign to take democracies apart around the world, and it involves casting doubt on the capacity of government, and it involves playing up, trumping up concerns about violence and disorder, which again are fair in some specific cases, but not universally so. And so I hope that we can keep this conversation in perspective. We have made tremendous advances around the world in terms of public health, in terms of longevity, in terms of women's right to control their own lives and their own bodies. And we've made many advances because we have had democracies, because we have had welfare states, and the attacks on those things are just terribly dangerous.
Due to the pandemic, we saw a lot of governments in Europe and the States being very closely with scientists. And this would be fully understandable exactly because we had and we're still having to face a pandemic and health issues, a health crisis. But we saw very quickly the lack of trust regarding the science and scientists. I remember how we were watching, attending, learning everything that WHO was announced every day, especially during the first period of the pandemic. And then it seems that something happened and we stopped listening, we stopped focusing, we stopped taking into account whatever WHO says. So I'm using this example because it's like a global example and not what happened to every country, to every government, and to national scientists of every country, in order to ask you if you also recognize this situation, and if yes, what is the explanation of it?
So, again, there's no doubt that many people are organized to express skepticism about government and government science. And we are clearly seeing in many countries on earth disputes about, whether vaccines work or are a plot to surveil us. Whether our governments really have our best interest in mind when they close down schools or close borders. And so I don't question at all that there are surges in distrust, and very powerful expressions of distrust. And those expressions get a lot of attention. And I want to go back to what I just said. I think we have some media outlets that are dedicated to pushing that kind of cynicism, to pushing the view that you should be distrustful. I just want to tell you that in December of 2021, not too long ago, last month, there was an article in the New York Times covering a new research study published by the Wellcome Trust, which is a foundation in London, with a poll and survey done by Gallup. And it showed a dramatic increase in trust in science globally from 2018 to 2020, with especially high increase in trust in science in East Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. Far less increased trust in science in the United States, but still in the United States, a net increase. And then a more recent study showed that the increase in distrust in science has come almost exclusively in the organized American right. And so do I think that there is a right-wing attack on scientific institutions that's quite ideological? By all means, and I think it's coordinated. I think there are some areas in the left where you see a kind of distrust for, pharmaceuticals and things like this that's based on a critique of capitalism. But I just want to emphasize that based on the empirical evidence we have right now, the net relationship to science and scientists over the last couple of years is that collectively we trust it more.
That was
Alex,
well put.
what do you think about it?
That was well put. I mean, I think that the pandemic, the vaccines, and that whole discussion has been politicized by certain groups to aid in a message that they want to get across. That it's a bunch of other things as well tied into that, not just exclusively vaccines and the pandemic. But I will say this, and when I try to have these conversations with people who may not agree with science, I simply ask them, do you go to the doctor? Do you go to the dentist? When you go to get your teeth cleaned, do you want your dentist to have gone to a reputable dental school to use the correct instruments in your mouth? And if you are needing medication, that he or she will prescribe you the correct medication that wouldn't interact with some other medication. And invariably, everybody always says yes. And then I ask them, the car you drive, the cruise control, the wipers, the anti-lock brakes, all of that is based on science. The phone in your hand, all of that was constructed with science. The vaccines you took to go to grade school when you were much younger, all of that was constructed with science. And so people are picking and choosing which science is acceptable to them and which science is unacceptable to them. I hope and pray that our world moves forward in the sense of science is what is designing to make our lives better. It's designed to make our lives easier in some respects and to live our lives for a longer period of time.
Before watching the pre-recorded interview that I mentioned in the beginning with Kiki Petroulaki, I would like to raise an issue that, if I remember correct, Alex, you mentioned from the beginning, the timing of the pandemic, because there is an issue in terms of the timing and in terms of the fact that it seems that we have a pandemic within another pandemic, and what happened, while we had to face the pandemic, at the same time, we had the murder of George Floyd in the US, which shocked worldwide. And we saw what happened to another countries and to another continents as well. So I would like to ask from you both if you would like to elaborate a little bit on that. And in addition, I would like to ask you if there is any link between the police violence and community violence.
I'll go ahead and start on this one. I think that, the horrific events of May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis, when George Floyd was killed, I think it highlighted to everybody in your face around the world what happens when police use of force excessively. And it also brought to light a lot of the social and racial injustice and feelings that certain communities, especially in the United States, but also around the world, have with respect to the abuse of power. I will say that that event did lead to some reforms in some police agencies in the United States. Those reforms take time. I also want to underscore that that event is not the typical case when police officers use force. In fact, the majority of officers never draw their gun in their entire careers, much less kill someone for a variety of different reasons. That was an atrocious event. I think everybody has decried that event. I think some good may have come out of that, out of the spotlight that it showed on these issues. At the same time, it also continues to underscore that, at least in the United States, when we look at the federal government to provide guidance and anything in this direction, we got politicization on both parties. You know, they try to advance different bills. There was agreement on both sides, the Republican and the Democrats, but they focused on their differences and did nothing. And the populace, you know, I take off my hat as a criminologist and I'm just a regular human being. We look to Washington to provide some sense of guidance sometimes, some sense of agreement sometimes. And here we are in 2022, and we still do not have a United States database on police use of force. So when I get reporters asking me, well, how many use of force incidents are there? I said, I don't know the answer to that, but the Washington Post has a database. And, you know, that's an unfortunate happenstance because you can't guide policy and make policy without data. So I think that the George Floyd killing has brought to light all of those kinds of issues, primarily in the United States, but as we saw in the protests around the world.
Eric?
Yeah, I guess I would just add, while it's true that the majority of officers do not use a gun in the conduct of their work or shoot a gun, in another way, there was nothing really shocking about the murder of George Floyd because there's just so much police violence and it's so disproportionately directed against Black people and brown people in this country. And around the world, we have seen police violence as an example of kind of extreme racial violence and racial discrimination. And so, as I see it, it was less about the shock of that and more about the fact that when George Floyd was murdered, billions of people were stuck at home, isolated, quarantined, not as busy as they ordinarily are, you know, not taken up with other kinds of activities that compete for their time and attention, watching a lot more television, spending more time on social media. And the highlight was just this kind of coincidence of history that we were paying attention. And there was something galling about it. And I think it also compounded an anger and frustration that people had. There was an anger about the situation. It had already become clear at that point in the United States that Black people weren't just more likely to be injured in a violent attack by police. Black people were more likely to be exposed to COVID. They're more likely to die of COVID. They were less likely to have good treatment. And, you know, in fact, even before that happened, there were studies showing that in the US, police officers were far more likely to arrest Black people for not wearing masks than they were white people. So they were selectively enforcing rules in ways that were infuriating. And so what was distinctive about the moment for me was less the violence of what the police did and more the capacity of people to do something about it and to organize and to act. And you remember, for many people, it was the first moment of gathering with other people in public settings. It was that murder was the stimulus that brought us out of our homes and back together in public space to express our democratic wish for a different society. And it's an extraordinary moment because, as you say, Anna, there were protests around the world. It spread beyond the United States. Really kind of a truly extraordinary uprising. And the challenge has been, can you sustain that level of commitment, that level of outrage, that political will to do something different, even as we get back to something that resembles life as usual. There were a lot of Black people at the time who were skeptical about all the white people who were finally showing up for marches, and said, well, it's curious that it's taken this, why now? And the skepticism was, are they still going to be doing this, marching urgently 1 year from now, 2 years from now? And I think that's the question of our time, really. How we now all of this stuff has been revealed. The racism, the expendability of life, the kind of failure of so many institutions. Now the question for us is what we're going to do about it. And so much lies in the balance.
And it's a big political issue, I would say. Let's watch the interview that Kiki Petroulaki, the president of the European Anti-Violence Network, gave to us. She discusses how the system in Greece fails to protect women who are into abusive marriages or relationships, and refers to an issue of great concern to great society, femicides. Kiki Petroulaki was interviewed by Thanasis Troboukis.
Κυρία Πετρουλάκη, ποιες εμφάνισεις βίας είδατε να αυξάνονται κατά τη διάρκεια της πανδημίας?
Φαίνεται ότι διάφορα είδη βίας αυξήθηκαν ως προς τη συχνότητά τους, όχι ως προς την εμφάνισή τους, τολμώ να πω. Και ανάμεσα σε αυτά είναι και η ενδοοικογενειακή βία και ενδεχομένως και άλλου τύπου διαπροσωπική βία, αλλά σίγουρα η έμφυλη βία έχει τα πρωτεία. Και βέβαια δεν μπορούμε να πούμε ότι αυξήθηκαν οι βίες συμπεριφορές, αλλά σίγουρα αυξήθηκε η ορατότητά τους. Η οποιαδήποτε δυσκολία, και η πανδημία είναι μια τέτοια, δεν κάνει τους ανθρώπους κακοποιητικούς. Απλώς οι κακοποιητικοί άνθρωποι εκμεταλλεύονται ως άλοθη την οποιαδήποτε δύσκολη εξωτερική συνθήκη, προκειμένου να γίνουν πιο βίαιοι, συχνότερα βίαιοι ή να αλλάξουν τύπο κακοποίησης. Δηλαδή, αν επιτύχαναν τον έλεγχο μόνο με ψυχολογική κακοποίηση, μπορεί τώρα να χρησιμοποιήσουν και σωματική και σεξουαλική. Και επίσης, η πανδημία κάτι που έκανε είναι ότι περιόρισε πάρα πολύ τις διεξόδους των γυναικών που κακοποιούνται.
Τι εμπόδια συναντούν οι γυναίκες όταν καταγγέλουν περιστατικά ενδοοικογενειακής βίας?
Το πρώτο εμπόδιο που πρέπει μια γυναίκα να διαχειριστεί είναι το δικό της, ειδικά αν έχει παιδιά. Δηλαδή πρέπει να αποφασίσει ότι θα καταγγείλει τον πατέρα των παιδιών της και αν είναι και μεγάλος ο κίνδυνος, πρέπει να πάρει και το ρίσκο αυτό να τον εξαγριώσει και να την κακοποιήσει ακόμη περισσότερο. Αφού τα υπερβεί αυτά και κάνει την καταγγελία της, από εκεί και πέρα η διαδικασία είναι αυτεπάγγελτη. Εφόσον έρθει σε γνώση των αρχών, θα πρέπει όλα να κινηθούν αυτόματα. Αυτό όμως δεν ισχύει. Αυτό που συμβαίνει πολύ συχνά είναι ότι οι γυναίκες ενημερώνονται ότι αν κάνουν μήνυση θα τους κάνει και ο δράστης αντιμήνυση και θα μείνουν όλη τη νύχτα μαζί με τα παιδιά για αυτόφορο στο τμήμα, φοβούνται και δεν κάνουν τη μήνυση και μετά, κακώς, δεν συνεχίζει η διαδικασία. Όσες όμως την κάνουν τη μήνυση, εάν δεν είναι κάτι πολύ βίαιο με σωματικές ενδείξεις, αυτό που θα συμβεί είναι ότι με ένα τηλέφωνο ο εισαγγελέας θα τον αφήσει ελεύθερο να γυρίσει στο σπίτι του. Ένα μεγάλο πρόβλημα που έχουν οι γυναίκες, αφού τα επιτύχουν όλα αυτά και έχουν με κάποιο τρόπο την επιμέλεια των παιδιών τους, είναι να βρουν χρήματα για να τα ταΐζουν. Και αυτή τη στιγμή, μόλις εχθές πληροφορήθηκα κι εγώ, ότι για μια γυναίκα με ένα παιδί που είναι επιλέξιμη για να παίρνει το ελάχιστο εγγυημένο εισόδημα, που είναι 300 ευρώ σε αυτή την περίπτωση, της αφαιρείται το επίδομα παιδιού, που σημαίνει ότι πρέπει με 160 ευρώ να ζήσει εκείνη και το παιδί, με 160 ευρώ το μήνα. Οπότε μετά νομίζω ότι είναι απλό να καταλάβουμε γιατί οι γυναίκες δεν φεύγουν.
Παρατηρούμε και μια αύξηση το τελευταίο διάστημα στις γυναικοκτονίες. Τι έχει αλλάξει?
Έχει αλλάξει η ορατότητα και πάλι. Δίνουμε πάρα πολύ μεγάλη έμφαση και πολύ καλά κάνουν επιτέλους τα μέσα να δίνουν έμφαση και να παρουσιάζουν σχεδόν κάθε μία, θα δούμε στο τέλος, όταν βγουν τα δεδομένα, αν ήταν όλες. Λάβετε υπόψη σας ότι πέρσι είχαμε 9 γυναικοκτονίες και 9 απόπειρες. Το γεγονός ότι οι δράστες αισθάνονται ότι μπορούν ατιμόρυτοι να συνεχίζουν να το κάνουν αυτό, και όχι μόνο το αισθάνονται, αλλά έτσι είναι. Όσο συμβαίνουν τα πλημεληματικού κατά τον νόμο χαρακτήρα αδικήματα, ο νόμος και η αστυνομία τα διαχειρίζεται σαν να είναι ένας απλός καυγάς μέσα στο ζευγάρι, σαν να είναι συνυπεύθυνοι. Και όταν ξαφνικά φτάσουμε στη γυναικοκτονία, όλοι τα ήξεραν. Οι γυναίκες είχαν κάνει αυτό που τους είπαμε, δηλαδή να ζητήσουν βοήθεια, ή σχεδόν όλες το είχαν κάνει, και όσες δεν το έκαναν για τους λόγους που είπαμε μόλις πριν. Γιατί είχαν τρομερά εμπόδια να αντιμετωπίσουν, και αυτή τη στιγμή εμείς τουλάχιστον γνωρίζουμε δεκάδες γυναίκες που είναι εγκλωβισμένες επειδή οι δράστες τις απειλούν ότι αν τολμήσουν να φύγουν θα πάρουν στην επιμέλεια των παιδιών, και ξέρετε τι σημαίνει αυτό. Ότι θα έχουν απεριόριστη πρόσβαση, και μάλιστα αυτή τη στιγμή μια γυναίκα που φεύγει και πηγαίνει σε ένα ξενώνα, αν δεν ενημερώσει που βρίσκεται η ίδια και το παιδί της, με τον νόμο αυτόν της υποχρεωτικής συνεπιμέλειας, θα τον ονομάσω εγώ, κινδυνεύει να θεωρηθεί κακή άσκηση της γονικής μέριμνας και να της πάρουν το παιδί. Αυτά τα πράγματα πρέπει οπωσδήποτε να διορθωθούν, και μετά να τολμάμε να ρωτάμε γιατί δεν φεύγει μια γυναίκα και γιατί αυξάνονται οι γυναικοκτονίες.
Okay, we're back. Since we have about 10 minutes to close this discussion, I would like to share some questions and comments that we have received from the viewers, unless you would like to comment anything on what we've heard. Okay, so one among the questions that we've received are many regarding the impact of the pandemic and the conditions on children, teenagers, etc. So this is also something that you have also referred to, and we see one very clear question here. How are children affected by domestic violence? For children, I mean that they had to stay at home and had to face domestic violence.
So I think that, to talk more about the schooling issue, and I don't want to speak for Eric, but as a professor, I need to be in the classroom. I need to see people around one another and the serendipity of ideas and discussions, and not little boxes on the screen. And that's, it's not just that part of the human interaction that we lost, literally being in a room together, but also for younger ages, the social skills development that they completely lost. Being around other people for a year and a half of their lives, going to athletic activities, band activities, whatever that is. And that's an integral part of the educational experience about social skill development, cognitive development. And some of that is just not easily translatable in a Zoom session. And so, a lot of my friends, and this isn't based on any kind of research, but a lot of my friends with kids say to me, I think we may have lost half of a year or 1 year of our educational experience, because it's not just the learning, it's everything else.
And we see right now another question, according to what you're describing, Alex, on our screens. One might say that education is the way to promote our minds and souls. Nowadays, most of us are becoming more educated and informed, but violence is on the rise. Are we getting the wrong education? I think that it fits very well with exactly what you're describing.
Well, could I just say, this again kind of worries me a little bit, because most of us are becoming more educated, but violence is on the rise. So let's be clear about this. With the rise of education in the 20th century and the early 21st century around the world, we did not see the rise of violence. We saw the opposite. The educating people is a very effective way of reducing violence. and decreasing all kinds of public health problems. It is not the right connection. And I will just put a point on what Alex said by mentioning, so I have 2 children who've been, often at home, much more than I would like during the pandemic. And my fear is not that there will be a lost generation where everyone has lost this time, but that the pandemic will dramatically accelerate and worsen the problem of inequality. Because children who are from families with resources, whose parents were able to, put time into education, who got them into some alternative way of learning or paid for private school or got a tutor or taught at home, those children are going to be pretty good. They've lost a lot, and they've had genuine and serious mental health issues. It's been very difficult for development in all kinds of social ways that are important. But if you are from a poor family, if you don't have home internet access, if your parents don't have the capacity or the time to work on your education, if you spent the last 2 years, on the streets or playing video games and not learning, and unfortunately, I think a lot of poor children around the world have had that experience. Not only are you worse off in an absolute sense, but you're even worse off in a relative sense compared to other people in your society who got those benefits. So for me, there are many dangers here, but they're summed up by this kind of danger of inequality and the possibility of lost opportunities. And for me, that's the kind of thing that should get us even more worried about the threat of future violence and other problems. So I don't mean to be too difficult about this point, but I think the problem with these conversations is we can too easily jump to, see, the problem is with all education. That's why there's more violence than ever before. We need to transform it. We need to be much more specific about what the problem is. And the diagnosis here is we've created a massive problem of inequality, and it got expressed in the pandemic. It's getting expressed today. And that is why are we concerned about democracy? Because it's just not working for too many people.
To underscore,
Eric, actually, it's sorry, Alex, for interrupting you. I think what Eric just described, it could be one of the traps. You referred to them earlier, that we should be very careful. Yes, Alex.
I think to underscore what Eric said is that a lot of Black and Brown communities, they were essential workers. They couldn't Zoom in for 6 months of their lives and have computers at home. And so a lot of those individuals that Eric talked about, a lot of them got infected. A lot of them went to the hospital. A lot of them couldn't take time off their jobs. And so kids were literally, in certain communities, literally didn't have, let's just grab a laptop. You can go sit in this part of the house and, I'll work from home and everybody's great. A lot of communities didn't see that. And so that problem gets exacerbated, not just education, but everything else that flows from a successful education experience and attainment.
That's a great point.
We have 3 minutes, and I want to add 2 more questions. One question, which is also comes from the audience. If we look at this pandemic as a learning experience, what might we as society do differently next time to avoid the increase in violence, which, as Alex mentions, might have been in some sense predictable? Alex, would you like to reply?
Let me just start off by saying that, as Eric said earlier, the last year and a half is in acute violence. Our long-term trends in the US and around most of the world is that crime has gone down and has stayed relatively low compared to what it was, in certain periods, like, for example, in the mid-'80s during the crack epidemic, and especially in the United States. I think, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this, but I think one thing that we have learned from this is the next time this happens, what did we do that worked well for us as people and as a society, and what didn't work well? So let's not revisit that and make that same mistake again. None of us, in my life, I never went into a lockdown for a month, so I didn't know what that was like. But now I know, I have a prior now. So I think that we need to have those, this is what worked, let's do it again. This is what didn't work, let's definitely not do it again.
Mm-hmm. Eric, I don't know if you would like to add anything. Otherwise, I have my last question, which refers especially to you, exactly because you mentioned the very crucial issue of lack of trust and the crisis that also our democracy should face and figure out. So what is the solution to violence, and what can we do about it? And of course, when I'm asking a question like that, I mean that this is a deeply political issue. So what is the responsibility of governments?
Well, could we agree to discuss this next summer at the Nostros Festival in Athens? Because we're not going to solve that problem right now in the last 30 seconds of our conversation. But I think you're right to point out that our conversation about violence is a very political one. And I think that's one of the reasons why the information varies so much. And I think another reason is that there is a bias in our way of processing information where we are always kind of more attuned to the crisis and the sensational. And, I think this has been a sensational crisis that we've lived through. I mean, we have really been through a historic moment. In future generations, I think we will look at 2020 the way that historians look at 1789 or 1786 or 1968 or 1941. This is a big year. And, equality in the health system. Oh, I lost you. So, what Marx once wrote about social transformation, all that is solid melts into air. And in the last few years, a lot of things that felt solid, social structures that felt very solid, felt as if they were melting. And the thing about this moment is, I don't know if you both feel this way, but it's really the first time in my lifetime where it feels like everything is up for grabs. I don't know if in 5 years, democracy in America will be over and we'll be in an authoritarian society, or if we'll have a Green New Deal and, we'll be decarbonizing. I don't know what's going to happen in Europe or Asia or Africa. We're living through a pivotal moment. And so I think collectively we could say that we failed to live up to the challenge of the pandemic. Far more people died than needed to. And I guess I think it's now time to, I agree with Alex, we need a kind of social autopsy of what went wrong. How did we fail and why in different places? We need to understand the places that did well and why they did well and how that happened. And then I think we need to be able to transform the lessons for the next big event. Because I don't know if it's a heat wave or if it's a pandemic or if it's a sustained assault on democracy, but I don't think this is the last crisis of our lifetime.
Thank you both very much for participating in this discussion, the 50th Dialogues discussion. Actually, since you mentioned that, Eric, next Nostos this year, Nostos will be about health and the quality and the quality actually on health, with a very rich and with a lot of food of thought, ideas and suggestions and cases in terms of the health, which is something that we should, all of us, we should take it more serious, governments and citizens as well, exactly because all of us finally need it. So stay with us this June. And of course, we will have our next Dialogues event at the end of February. Thanks a lot again, both of you. Thanks all of you for your questions, messages, comments, etc. For those who didn't watch our discussion from the beginning, you may find the on-demand video on our website, snfdialogues.org. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care.